Welcome to our second virtual event, Probing the Silences, Reconstructing the History of Armenian Women in Iran. I am Professor Berberian, Merouni Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies, and I am joined this evening by Professor Talinn Grigor and Dr. Talar Chahinian, and we are going to be having a conversation about this very topic. I hope you and your loved ones are doing well. I know these are difficult times for everyone. Before introducing Talar, I would like to say a few words about an upcoming important event of sorts on next Wednesday, actually this coming Wednesday, next week on June 3rd, which also happens to be my sister's birthday, so just so you know. UCI will be hosting its annual Giving Day. It is a one-day online giving event where our whole UCI community comes together to support various causes across the university. This year, for the first time, we are having a Giving Day campaign to raise funds for UCI Armenian language. And you may know that UNESCO listed Western Armenian as an endangered language. At UCI, we're committed to preserving Armenian language that matters to so many of us by offering students courses in Western Armenian. And these courses are crucial in contributing to the survival and flourishing of the Armenian language in the diaspora. No matter the size of your gift, your generosity and participation on Giving Day will have a meaningful impact on our students. It ensures that our students can meet the core requirements to the new minor in Armenian Studies by taking these language courses. To encourage energetic participation from our community, the Gulbenkian Foundation has generously offered to match the first $6,000 raised toward the Armenian Language Instruction Fund on Giving Day. So each of your gifts will have double its impact. If you haven't yet, I ask you to join us on June 3rd and make a gift. You can also help us by sharing our campaign with your friends and family and on your social media to encourage more participation. It is the strength of our community that will help us continue our mission and reach our goals. Please mark your calendar for June 3rd, Wednesday, and stay tuned for more information as we get closer to Giving Day. Thank you for letting me talk about Giving Day. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Talar Chahinian, who will be moderating our conversation this evening, and she will also introduce a bit about the project and the two of us. Dr. Talar Chahinian lectures in the program of Armenian Studies at UC Irvine, where she is also research associate in the Department of Comparative Literature. Her research interests include Western Armenian language and literature, transnational studies, politics and aesthetics, and translation. She is co-editor of Diaspora, a journal of transnational studies, and she contributes regularly to the online journal Critics Forum and the literary magazine Pakin. Thank you both for being here, and thank you, Talar, for agreeing to moderate.
It's my pleasure. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to all of our participants to this exciting panel. As Houri was mentioning just a while ago, we've had over 130 RSVPs for this event, which is an amazing number. And I think this number is really a testament to how eager we all are to partake in this conversation and learn more about the history of Armenian women in Iran and what the process of writing this history entails. The historical significance of today's date does not elude us. I should just make a quick note about that. May 28 is the celebratory holiday that marks the institution of the first independent Armenian Republic. And on this day, I'm really excited to be talking history and to be talking history's exclusions. Just a few quick notes about the format. So we're using a Zoom webinar format, which means that while you're able to see the three of us on your screen, we can't see you and you can't see each other. We are going to have a conversation for about 45 minutes. After that, we will be opening up the floor for questions in the form of written down questions. And when we get there, I'll explain that in further detail. I'd also like to note that today's conversation is being recorded and will go on the UCI Armenian Studies YouTube channel. So at the end of our conversation, we'll be asking you to type your questions. But please note from now that given the large number of attendees that we're hosting today, we may not be able to get to everybody's questions. We'll do our best. We'll see how we're doing with time and how the conversation moves along. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our panelists and the topic of their new project, which brings us all together today. Houri Berberian is Professor of History, Mehruni Family Presidential Chair in Armenian Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Her research interests include revolutionary movements, women and gender, and identity and diaspora. She is the author of Armenians and the Iranian Constitutional Revolution, and most recently, the award-winning Roving Revolutionaries, as well as the co-editor of Reflections of Armenian Identity in History and Historiography. Talinn Grigor is a professor of art history and chair in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of California, Davis. Her research focuses on 19th to 21st century art and architectural histories through the theoretical framework of post-colonial and critical theories. Her 3 books include Building Iran, Contemporary Iranian Art, and the forthcoming The Persian Revival, to be published by Penn State in 2021. Probing the Silences, Reconstructing the History of Armenian Women in Iran is the tentative title of the book project that they'll be talking about today. This is a co-authored book project which explores the individual, collective, and organizational lives of Armenian women in Iran from the 1850s to 1979. So I'd like you to start with asking you to say a little bit more about the book specifically and its scope. Both of you are coming from slightly different disciplinary backgrounds. Houri, your training is in history. Talinn, you're an art historian. Can you tell us how your collaboration, your co-authorship came about?
Sure. What we wanted to, thank you again, by the way, Talar. What we wanted to do with the book, and we've only recently begun this project, is to demonstrate the way that Armenian women in Iran have been represented, and for us, more importantly, how they have represented themselves, starting with in the mid-19th century with Nasruddin Shah's reign to the end of the Pahlavi period, stopping at the revolution of 1979. We focus on the larger umbrellas of educational, cultural, charitable, political, intellectual realms, each represented by one or multiple women's organizations or institutional entities. For example, and I'm only going to include 2, but this is not exclusive, the Bare Korzagan Ganans Miuchun and the Haigin Miuchun. And interestingly enough, I wanted my second book to be about Armenian women in Iran, and I did produce a couple of articles about it. But for reasons we'll address soon, it didn't materialize. One was access to Iran. I was denied a visa twice. And also, I didn't have an into the Iranian-Armenian informal social networks. And here Talinn plays a very important role in plugging into that network with family members on both her mother's and father's side being involved in these very women's organizations that I just mentioned. So the idea came about in the second feminist Armenian Studies workshop that was held about a year ago in early May. And it was co-organized by Lerna Ekmekçioğlu at MIT and Melissa Bilal now at UCLA and myself. And it was the second one. The first one was held in MIT, and you have a poster of it right behind you, Talar. And it was not done on purpose. And this was co-organized by Lerna and Melissa. And it was this second one at UCI was very successful in generating a whole new level of discussion. We know that there are very little, almost no studies done on Armenian women, and there are actually, except for a couple of articles, no studies done on Armenian women in Iran. There is a growing scholarship on Armenian women in the Ottoman Empire, but a significant community, like the Armenian community in Iran, has fallen on the wayside, and we did not want that to continue. And so how do you write such a history? We wanted to approach it through representation. We didn't want to do it as a survey of individual women, sort of a listing of women, but a more collective, organizational, institutional history that really questions or challenges the androcentric narrative or commonly accepted discourse that is current about women, about Armenian women.
Thank you, Houri, for organizing this. Thank you, Talar, for moderating this. I also want to thank you, our audience, among whom we actually have many people who have helped us get here. So I'm grateful for this opportunity for us to have this conversation, because it has already helped us sort of gather our thoughts and find out what's important. So we're looking forward to share with you what we have discovered so far. So during the May workshop, we noticed that my paper, which dealt with Armenian women, female architects of the 60s in Iran, was the only one on Iran. And I actually used Houri's scholarship for the early part of the century, but when I got to the 60s, there literally was no scholarship on Armenian women. And so I resorted to what I had, which were photographs. So after my talk, there were two questions that propelled a conversation between Houri and me about this eventually became this book. One was, how are Armenians and Armenian women of Iran somehow unique, and whether the needle has been moved, meaning how did Armenian women's activism has impacted their status. So then more conversation raised actually methodological questions about the multidisciplinary aspect of this study, that this work cannot be written simply by one person, because it is multidimensional. So we feel that it requires two experts that work in different periods. So we're dealing with the longue durée history. Houri being a 19th century expert, I'm a 20th century expert. So we can do the stretch between the mid-19th century to the revolution. The second aspect is that it seems that it requires two disciplinary and source-based expertise. So history, archival textual materials, but also art historical materials that complement each other. And thirdly, sort of the know-how in navigating both formal and informal networks. So someone like Houri, who knows how to find very obscure newspapers from 1891, or the ARF archives, and connect the political to domestic, or my own connections in the community. Ultimately, all of these come together. And so we realized that a comprehensive and in-depth history of modern Armenian women in Iran through traditional methods is simply not possible.
So what are the sources of such a project?
All right, so
okay, yes, we have a PowerPoint for this as well.
Yeah,
That's
yes.
great.
So we started looking into how else do women leave historical records behind. And we started to look at material culture, visual evidence, photography, informal documents, costumes, exhibition catalogs. And so in the PowerPoint, you're seeing some of the evidence that we have managed to collect. So, of course, we start with photography because this was really the hallmark of Nasiri period. Nasiruddin Shah not only being the first photographer in Iran, but also he was one of the earliest selfie guy. I mean, he loved to take selfies with his wives in the harem. So on your left, you are looking at Antoine Sevrugin's studio photos of Armenian women, where he has a number of these, where he portrays this kind of ethnographically noble representation of Armenian women, which is different from how he photographs Kurdish women. And on your right, you're seeing, we're seeing a shift in the use of photograph by women. So on the top, you are looking at the photograph of Hasmik Voskanian, who was a female owner of a studio, a photo studio in Tehran for almost half a century. And she had many female clientele. So we're looking at what happens when the camera goes into a female hand. And below, you're looking at Armenian women who are now using photo studios as instruments of middle-class leisure. So there's a playful, more sort of agency into how they are being photographed, which is no longer ethnographic. Then we're also looking at how photograph is used by the state. So you're looking at a Kayhan, a prominent pro-Pahlavi newspaper that is publishing these numerous photographs of the Arab Women's Basketball Championship in 1968. So they became the national champion. And so we're also looking at how there's this state appropriation of Armenia's women, healthy, athletic bodies in the Pahlavi civil society discourses. And then we move on to other evidences. The hiking organization's costume exhibition was really a marker in this history in 1974. They deployed very traditionally female craft like sewing and textile to inject Armenian women's history into a larger Pahlavi sort of use of folklore, celebration of folklore art. So in the opening of the exhibition was launched by Empress Farah. And it's we're looking at how Armenian women are participating in her regionalist royal patronage. And then in 1978 came the publication of the catalog, which really, I think it's the tour de force. They did an amazing amount of advertisement. They used mass media, and you can see on the left side of your slide, they collected all the different commentaries from mass media, foreign, domestic, as well as state-owned, to advertise the coming of the exhibition. Superbly photographed and professionally written. So here they are narrating a national history, Armenian national history, through the costumes. I mean, they're talking about queens and how great they were. And so they're writing their own version of Armenian history. And what is interesting on the left, on the comments here, is that there's sort of hiking is never mentioned, nor are women ever mentioned as either subjects or authors. So here we're seeing a kind of modesty as a strategy of power.
So in addition to the kinds of sources that Talinn mentioned, we are conducting and have conducted oral history interviews, oral interviews. And the pandemic stopped us for a little while. We had a few scheduled, but um, those women were kind enough to help to say it's okay, we'll postpone it, we can do it again. And some of them are listening in and watching us as we speak. So thank you very much for that. So oral history has been used by many historians who recognize that traditional sources have often neglected women. It has become a means by which to integrate women into scholarship. So oral interviews that we're doing with women is in a way to privilege their own voices rather than others' voices about them, to place them at the center of history and to foreground their own understanding of their place in the history of Armenian women in Iran. So through interviews, we have come across great private archives and collections, correspondence, photographs. You see an example here, educational records. On your right, you see a 1931 report card, for example. On the left is a graduating class of women. So these private archives are actually quite rich, quite rich. In addition, through the interviews, we've come across and have done more research and found more archives created by organizations themselves, whether it's the Chahinian on your right or the Parekordzagan on your left. These organizations often publish yearlies or amyaks, sort of anniversary publications, organizational anniversary publications. And what we're doing, in addition to obviously reading the text and learning more about the organization's activities, we are cross-referencing between textual evidence and visual evidence. So just to give you an example, on the right side with Chahinian, there are a list of 9 co-founders, and the photo actually shows at least several of those 9 co-founders. So we are doing this kind of cross-referencing that is very important. We are looking at, as you can see on the bottom row, a number of these are only 3. A number of reports and anniversary publications. But we are also looking at contemporary Armenian language newspapers published in Iran. I'd like to point out that unlike the Ottoman Empire, Armenian women in Iran did not have a journal that was dedicated solely to Armenian issues or was published solely by Armenian women. However, we have found many allusions, references, outright articles about Armenian women. And here you see a collage of some of the newspapers, and you see the illustrations in the covers that depict women. Now, 2 of the newspapers that we've come across that have intrigued us, I would say, and we are going to delve into more, are 2 satirical newspapers. One is Boboch, meaning monster. The Western Armenian pronunciation obviously is Popoch, but we're talking about Iran, so Boboch. It appeared between 1920 to 1937. And the other one, which we'll come back to, but I just want to show you, is Tsahabel, which means birch broom, which was published between 1943 and 1958. So Boboch is one of those satirical newspapers that basically makes women the brunt of their jokes. And so as painful as it is sometimes to read it, you can't help but smirk a little now and then. But basically, the jokes betray, in a sense, the accepted views of women by contemporary society. And it uses jokes and other illustrations to critique women and to critique society. I mean, that's what satire does. So on your left, you see a depiction of the evolution of fashion from 1875 to 1940. This was published in 1925. And in 1875, obviously, you see the very conservatively dressed woman. I don't think anything is showing but her hands and her face. And then the projection that in 1940, fashion will have evolved and women will be wearing nothing. It took longer than Bobo had anticipated, but so what is the point of this? Obviously, it's not just about fashion, but it is again the use of woman's body to critique modernization. So critique modernization of fashion through showing women's evolution in fashion, and obviously the conclusion is that it's not good. Where it's going is not good. And Talinn will talk a little bit about Tsahavel later, and you'll see how that also plays out in Tsahavel as well. On the right side, you see sort of the borrowing from classic notion of nation as a woman. And here, the nation is depicted as somewhat anorexic, obviously very weak, coming at the seams, basically, in the arms, because she is being pulled by men who represent the political parties of the time. So on the right, the illustration is inverted, so you might not see it. But the one on the right represents the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, the Tashnafchun. On the left is the Ramgavar Sahmanatragan party, and the little guy pulling at the leg is actually the Hanchakyan party. This also tells you sort of the politics of the Armenian community. The Ramgavars and the ARF, especially, were the dominant parties, and the Hanchakyan, at least in the Iranian community, in the Armenian community in Iran, was not as important. They are all saying the same thing. They're all doing the same thing. I'm going to rescue you. I'm going to save you. So it is the saving of the nation through the depiction of that nation in the form of a woman. And so obviously what's going on here is it shows the gender dimensions of national politics. And again, the use of the woman's body to play out not only national politics internationally, but also national politics, as you can see here, domestically within the Armenian community in Iran.
So moving on to Tsahavel, we see from the 20s to the 50s the same use of satire and imagery is being repeated here. So on your left, we are looking at an urban, modern environment. This is sort of what Shah had dreamt of for Tehran, flanked by two women on two sides. Both of them are Tsahavel's commentary about the appropriate and inappropriate ways of being modern. Obviously, the left one is not recommended by Tsahavel. The right one is recommended. But what is interesting about this image is that in the background, in the back part of the image, we're seeing this sort of Orwellian head of probably the Tsahavel's chief editor, who is doing the critique. So this is another way of commenting the evolution of modern women and their modernity. In a way, it's a commentary about this notion of the modern yet modest, which would become very in with the coming of the Empress. On the right, you are looking at 5 members of the Church-Loving Women's Union, which was actually organization that was under the auspices of the prelate, a purely women's organization, and this is another organization we would love to have the archives. And so here, what they're doing, they're building the building of the prelacy, barefoot in the mud, doing the hard work, moving the dirt and bringing in the bricks. The caption is a sharp critique of Tehran's women's organization, so all the other more independent women's organization. And the caption claims that, look, they have money, but we don't see them building any cultural buildings, whereas these women are. And what's very curious about this image, and these are the kind of details that we're going to tease out of these archives, these works, is that these women, super hardworking, barefoot in the mud, but they're wearing their Sunday best. So
these are quite amazing images. I hope you consider including some of these illustrations in the final project. We can't get, I mean, I can't get enough in just that brief sneak peek that you just offered. Both of you alluded to certain limitations in accessing sources, and generally tangentially referred to limitations when you were framing the project. What can you tell us about the challenges that you encounter in the process of not only collecting, researching, but putting together and writing a book like this?
That's a great question. We are really dealing with silences and loud silences, if I may. It's really sort of a breakdown of the production of institutional and other kinds of knowledge in multiple ways. We knew there would be silences, especially scholarly silences, but we didn't really expect the number of silences that we've come across. So there are the archival silences. There's the inaccessibility to Iran. Some of the difficulties of doing research there without risk, but we have found private collections, private archives housed in Iran by 3 of the most important Armenian women's organizations that we mentioned earlier: Haygin, Parekordzagan, Ganans Miyuchun, and Yegeret Saser, Ganans Miyuchun. However, we have at this point been unable to gain access to them. We hope that will change. We hope that as we progress with this project, we'll be able to get all the material that we need. Of course, there are probably dozens or more other private archives we are completely unaware of. We are interested in private collections, whether related to Haygin or Parekordzagan or Yegeret Saser. If anyone has such collections and would want to share them with us to help us tell this story of Armenian women in Iran, we would love to hear from you. And all you have to do is email us. And it's very easy to find our email. You just Google our name, it'll show up. So no excuses. There also sort of the absence of archival documentation, whether it's through neglect or erasure or abandonment of archives, or even eventual loss of material that had actually been initially preserved. We're talking about multiple levels of silences.
And so the other more unexpected absence that we have encountered so far are sort of what we call the agency silences in several forms. Of course, we have had a lot of the private collection that we have already collected have been because of the generosity and enthusiasm of those who have very generously given us this material. But then we're meeting these agency silences that are methodologically interesting. I mean, the way that the first one, for example, we call it a sincere modesty, out of a sincere modesty, where we have reached out to women who, despite archival records, insist that I haven't done anything. Sort of this is, of course, not exclusive to Armenian women. This is about gendered upbringing, where talking is considered boasting, which is different from the way that there was an intentional modesty as a power strategy that was calculated into, for example, the hiking catalog or advertisement. So, but there is this notion that I haven't done anything, but we know that they have done a lot and they have done amazing things. The second one is sort of this self-imposed silence, a form of self-censorship where we have met influential women who categorically resign to participate in knowledge production. Sort of this notion that, oh, I don't remember anything, I have kept nothing, this kind of just being resigned to being an agent in one story that must have been so important at the time. And the third one is sort of this internalized sense of marginalization. I did something and I do remember and I was there, but it's not worth writing. It's, why do you want this material? So we're playing with this instability of this informal knowledge production. And what we're doing is that we're taking all of this and we're trying to cross-reference, corroborate, or fill in the gaps with the material evidence, with the visual evidence, that for us it's much easier to tease out and fill in and substantiate the instability of the informal and the stability of the formal.
To add to the silences, there are also scholarly silences. Other than biographical accounts of and community-oriented collections, there's an absence of foundational knowledge and scholarship on Armenian women in Iran. While we have seen important scholarship emerging on Armenian women in the Ottoman Empire, we cannot say the same for Iran. Works on the history of Iranian women also bypass Armenian women for the most part. So the scholarly silences are on multiple levels, not just on the Armenian level. So we are starting from scratch to some extent, reconstructing the history of a whole community of women in Iran by corroborating scattered material, visual evidence with textual evidence on the longue durée, in which women's voices are foregrounded as primary evidence, is crucial to this endeavor. And one major point we would like to emphasize, and do so in this project, is that this is not just the story of Armenian women in Iran or the Armenian community in Iran, because we can't view this history as in an insular fashion. This is a history that is part of a broader Iranian, even wider regional Middle Eastern, but ultimately even a bigger history than that. It's a history of minority state politics. It is a history of accommodation as well as challenges to patriarchy in its many forms, among other things. So we're very excited about the promise of this project. We are excited about the project itself, and I think we both believe that we have only hit the tip of the iceberg.
I want to thank you both so much for giving us this teaser of your findings, a sneak peek into this project. and also for sharing with us your process, telling us a little bit about how it works behind the scenes. And most importantly, I want to thank you for embarking on this storytelling project that doesn't aim to produce a homogeneous kind of narrative, but rather one that celebrates the individual voices of its subjects. So thank you so much for that. It looks like we did great with time, and we are able to take some questions from our participants, from our audience members. So at this point, I ask you to please draft questions that you may have to our panelists in kind of a concise format that you then pitch to us, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can, given the time we have left. So I invite you to do that for us right now, if you have any questions.
So I think we can all see the questions. Thank you for the comment of the first one. So we can, if you want, we can go to the second question. The first one's a comment. Thank you.
All right. So we have from an anonymous attendee the question that follows. I'll try to give a shout out to our participants as their names are coming up. The Popoch art depicting parties and motherland was signed by Saruhan. Is it depicting the politics in Egypt or in Iran?
It is. I mean, the Popoch was actually published in Tehran, even though the artist may be depicting, and then we might find actually illustrations that are copies from other journals. That did often happen, but the fact that it appears in the Armenian language newspaper published in Iran, to us indicates that this is really depicting the Iranian experience. It may be the Iranian-Armenian experience. It might also apply to others. It does apply to others. Nevertheless, it is, in my opinion, and Talinn, you can agree or disagree, about Iran, about the Armenian community in Iran.
All right, thank you. We have Armenian asking, are you limiting your study to women's organizations in Tehran only, or will you study women's activities in New Julfa, Tabriz, or other places? For example, women had an important role in New Julfa in facilitating the work of merchant husbands who would travel to Europe or the East for long periods of time.
Talinn, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Actually, we are very aware of the importance of the New Julfa community. We are not focused only on Tehran, and actually the book will start with establishing how Armenian women were represented, either through European travel logs, through their own produced documentation in the Safavid period, or the missionary archives. That's another important thing we're going to tap into. And so the book really starts with establishing what Armenian women, what was their perception or other people's perception about them, and so much of it is about New Julfa in the time that they were very powerful, in 1850. So we're going to start already the narrative with representation, and an established discourse about Armenians, but particularly Armenian women, and definitely we're going to sort of bring in that New Julfa history into our narrative as a flashback to that important period. And that also goes into how Armenians are different in Iran in the sense that at some point in history, they had a special relationship with the state. And that relationship returns in the 60s and 70s. And so we want to talk about the women's role in establishing those minority state relations.
Thank you. We have another question asking if there is a significant number of if there are a significant number of literary figures among the Iranian Armenian women that you're looking at.
Talinn? No? You want me to take this? There are Iranian Armenian women literary figures, but I don't know to what extent. I think one scholar whose work you can look at in terms of Armenian women writing, although it's not necessarily the early period that we're discussing, but perhaps a later period, is Claudia Yagubi. She writes on Armenian women, so literary figures to some extent.
Can I
oh, yes, please.
That we're going to be very mindful not to write biographies and not to write. We really are committed to writing an organizational, communal history, discursive history of Armenian women and their relationship not only to the state, the monarchy, the institution of the monarchy, their own political parties, Armenian political parties, the Armenian Church. So we're constantly are going to look at how women are navigating their very vicarious place in different times in the larger Iranian society. Women in the 1850s, 1860s, 70s, they have a very different place and very different relationship through the missionaries to the state and their own community, their church, their schools, their political parties than in the 1960s. So we're very careful of not sort of focusing on individual achievements. Of course, that will be there, but not as a discursive aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Ani Shirvanian would like to know if newspapers like Tsahavel still exist in Iran, and if so, are they still utilizing similar satirical usage of women or representing women in such a way?
I don't know of any Armenian language satirical newspapers that still exist in Iran. I don't even know if there are Persian language satirical newspapers in Iran, but that's my own ignorance. I think it's much more difficult under the current circumstances to publish the kinds of things that Tsahavel published. And Tsahavel ended its publication in 1958, so I haven't come across any similar satirical Armenian language newspapers in Iran after that.
Okay. Shake Kaftarian says absolutely excellent preview of your book. We're getting a lot of comments like that. I'm going straight to the questions. She says, I ask explication of the theme of modern yet modest, which I think is a true characteristic of Armenian women of Iran, past and present. So could you guys elaborate a little bit, or perhaps put it in historical context, that reference you made when close reading one of the images?
So this is not our idea. People who have worked on this, Professor Sansarian, Professor Najmabadi, they are the ones who have come up with these notions that at some point women especially activated by the Queen after her marriage to the king in 1959, where she wanted to present the Iranian woman as modern, yet modest, yet so that it would be able to merge the image of the European avant-garde modernity with the more conservative notions of ethical modesty and ethical parameters. And she did a very good job of doing that. She presented a whole new notion of how to be an Iranian modern woman, and so we're going to be very mindful of that, and we're going to be looking at what are some of the discourses about the Armenian woman, modern yet modest, and how are Armenian women pushing back on this, or encouraging this, or advocating this. So it's sort of a multi-dimensional relationship between the state, between the Armenian patriarchy, between Armenian women, either on this side or the other side. So it's a pretty complex, because it's not just about women in a society, but a minority women in a society on a very long period of time.
Thank you. Lerna, and we just have Lerna, I'm making an assumption about which Lerna this is, says, thank you for this
Maybe
treat.
we should tell the audience which Lerna this is.
I'm assuming this is Lerna Kmekciolu. Just based off of the question, let me read it, and then you guys can address this maybe more at length. So she says, thank you for this treat. I cannot wait until we compare Armenian women in different diaspora centers. I was wondering if Iranian Armenian women wrote memoirs in which they talked about their previous experiences in these organizations. I was wondering if the layers of self-silencing you recognized in oral history interviews, the three that Talinn mentioned, would be reflected in the memoirs.
Do you want me to take the first part and you can take the second part?
Sure.
Or do you want to take the whole thing?
No. You take the whole thing. I don't think I don't remember memoirs.
Yeah.
So
we haven't come across any memoirs, but one way we sort of, I think, balance that silence out is through these amyaks, through these anniversary publications over the organizations. So, for example, Pare Korzagan Miuchun, which began in like 1905, had 100th anniversary publication, and between 1905 and that 100th anniversary publication continued to publish about its activities. So you see women, you find out about women through these yearlies or through these anniversary publications. And if women wrote memoirs, they weren't published that I know of, and I'm happy to be wrong. But they might have written memoirs that we just haven't seen because they're hidden in someone's family private archives. We welcome seeing those too. So we wouldn't. The silences, though, are not in the publications. They're actually talking about their activities, but they don't talk about it on an individual level. They talk about the organization. You see names, but it's not about my own personal contribution kind of thing. Memoirs tend to be sort of that way.
And also we very intentionally stop at 1979, in part because we don't have expertise after that, and we're guessing that there is a huge amount of material after that other people do tap into and write about, especially in Iran. So far, so there must be memoirs after that, but we are not looking. We haven't looked there yet, and I'm not sure if we would. Before that, as Houri said, we're dying for any of this kind of archival publications, to have them, know them, include them.
Thank you. Claudia Yarubi says, thank you for this fascinating project. I can't wait to read it, and has two questions. Number one, were Armenian women active participants in the constitutional revolution? And two, did you find any writings by women other than in journals and magazines?
I guess I'll take this as the constitutional revolution specialist. To some extent, yes, they were active, but not necessarily as fighters or fedais. They weren't active in the same way that that Armenian men were active in the Iranian constitutional revolution. And I talk about this uh, uh, in my first book, and also in the article on Armenian women. The way that Armenian women participated in constitutional revolution was through education and a kind of activism that was not necessarily fighting, but it was about organizing, spreading the word about constitutionalism, educating girls, etc. So it was a different kind of activism, but yes, they were there. And in terms of other kinds of writings, in addition to newspapers and journals, which is rare, even that, there aren't that many women writing in these newspapers and journals. The only other evidence of women writing are these anniversary publications or reports of Armenian women's organizations. Obviously, they're doing the writing of their own activities. But so far, that's the extent of what we have found.
If I could add one interesting thing about these amyags, is that the first, especially those published after the revolution, the first like 30 pages are letters from different patriarchy and prelate and the Arashnortaran and the Ejmiadzin and the Giligiadis. And so it's very interesting the way that there's this national history, and then actually the women's history by women starts after the 30th page, after reproducing these authentic letters that confirm the importance of the organization.
Houri, you were talking a little bit about women's participation in organizing or in the education field in general. We have a question from Talinn who says, have you had a chance to look into Armenian schools, their origins and their curriculum for women, and what kind of impact they had on Armenian women before and after revolution?
So at the risk of, again, talking about myself, I wrote an article on Armenian women in Iran where I actually trace their founding of Armenian girls' schools, but also Armenian girls and boys' schools, co-ed schools. They have been very important, instrumental in the education of youth in Iran from the 19th century onwards. Their main focus was to find a way to offset the influence of missionary schools, because Armenians sent their children to missionary schools before the creation of Armenian schools, especially Armenian girls' schools. The curriculum often involved Armenian language, Armenian history, religion, that kind of thing, but also things that were deemed essential for women: embroidery, art, the craft of sewing, etc. So they were preparing really the future mothers. They're not necessarily those who were going to go out and find employment in the public sector.
We have our next question from Nelly Der Kurerian, who asks, who sponsored the Armenian Iranian organizations and how did these organizations help empower other younger women in the community?
You want me to take it, or?
Yeah.
Okay. You can always add. So those women's organizations, I assume you mean, were sponsored by the women themselves. So the co-founders of these organizations often put in the money to do whatever needed to be done, whether it was charitable work in the case of Parekord Zagan Ganans Viechun, or in the case of Haigin, whether it was intellectual work or whether it was building school buildings. Whatever it was done by these women who were often from a upper class background. Who were often sponsored by husbands, other male members, but a lot of it they did on their own.
And didn't they also have fundraising events? I mean, the bazaar was a very important fundraising event. We haven't looked into it, but we will, because we're sort of very actively searching the photographer of the hiking catalog and some of the ones who were producing it. So I'm sure the catalog it was sold extensively, and so I'm sure it brought some income. So it was sort of this typical fundraising and then channeling into what was a priority for them.
Mm-hmm. Right. We have a question from Anahid, who, again, thanks you for this great seminar and project, and asks, would the book be covering Armenian women who were genocide survivors? Armenian Catholic women were very active in social activities, plus preserving the Western Armenian culture and traditions. So if you can talk about where the genocide periods fits into your project.
Fine. You want to take this?
I think that so the second chapter would mostly cover the activities of Grigor Zagan that had branches. So it was active in Tabriz, in Isfahan, in Tehran. And actually, if I'm not wrong, they opened their Tehran branch, the latest. So, and their focus was charitable. And they were the longest. So they were already a very well established and functioning organization. And I think some of unless we come up with incredibly interesting and new material that's going to change the narrative, but so far we have a feeling that the genocide-related activities are going to go under the Grigor Zagan chapter, because we have in the Amyaks we have letters from Etchmiadzin and other places where the church is reaching out to Grigor Zagan and asking them that people are coming, please take care of them, please, they're in dire situation. So the genocide narrative is somehow going to be wrapped in charitable activities that is going on, unless we find new material, and then we'll. In general, we're going to be very inclusive and very loose about what Armenian means, what Catholic means, so we're. For us, it's very important how they represent themselves. and how they establish their own relationship with different organizations and institutions and definitions of identity. Houri, you want to add something? No.
Nope.
All right. Moving on to our next question, which is from Dr. Melissa Bilal, who, along with historian Lerna Akmekcioglu, who asked a question just a little while ago, organized that conference that we keep mentioning about, the poster of which is on my wall, on feminist interventions in Armenian studies. So Melissa says, thank you to Houri and Talinn for this wonderful and inspiring conversation. She's excited and motivated from this talk. My question, you may guess, is if you have come across any connections or any mentions of Armenian women in the Ottoman or Russian empires.
Nope.
Well,
Go ahead.
if you mean Russian, if you include Republic of Armenia in the Russian Empire, we do have Hiking invited a couple of now I'm forgetting the names, but they invited a couple of self-declared feminists in the 60s and hosted them in Tehran, or maybe even 50s. So there is that sort of Tbilisi elite, Yerevan elite, and even Cairo, or maybe even Istanbul. So there are women networks that Hiking especially is very tapped into, and we just need to read more about it. But we do feel that they were connected.
I think I agree, and I think there are probably connections with other organizations. I would be very curious about Hygin. Lerna's doing the work. Hygin in Paris, for example, and then I noticed Lerna's next question. She mentions that Yerdasat Hayuhi of Beirut was reporting on their activities occasionally. So it's very possible that these connections will become more obvious. We have tidbits of it right now, but it would be very interesting, and I think we would both love to see a more systematic or elaborate connection between these women's organizations in the Middle East and even in Europe.
One of my students, Vanessa Kasperian, is very excited about your project and is wondering when the book is coming out. I think many people are eager for your final product. Tell us, you've been talking about process, so where?
Yeah, I mean, the idea came to us in May of last year. So obviously, this is not the only thing we do, unfortunately. We each have our projects. Tallinn's book is coming out in 2021. So we're doing other things on the side in addition to teaching and so forth. So it's a process that will take a few years. So if it's going to be done well, and if it's going to be comprehensive and analytical and not just a collection of tidbits, it will take a few years. But hopefully we will continue to keep you up to date on our progress, and maybe that'll be satisfactory.
I think for us, one of the most important thing is to get to the archives, get to the Bargor Zagan, Hiking, and church-loving women's organization. These three archives are extremely important to us. We have pondered, but then we have decided against going to Iran due to the situation, only aggravated by COVID-19. So I think once we get to this archives, once we have like 300 pages of original material, like from 1891, that would really sort of set the path for actually starting to write and starting to narrate a comprehensive and original story with these original voices. I mean, they do a great job with the Amyaks, but as historians, sort of we want to see that old paper to sort of confirm for ourselves. So that's the big chunk of why or when this book will be written.
Okay, I think this is a good point as you're projecting forward and preparing us for when we shall be receiving the final product and reading it up. I think it's a good point to bring our conversation to a conclusion. I know we have about 28 questions left to answer. I asked I'm sorry we can't get to all of them given to due to our time restriction, but I'm sure Talinn and Houri will be going through them, and perhaps if I think there's some even information there that may be useful, going through them and responding. I want to thank you again for sharing all of this with us. I want to thank our participants for engaging closely, for their questions, and for just being here and spending the afternoon with us. And Houri and Talinn, I wish you all the best in continuing along with this project. And I chime in with everybody else in saying I can't wait to read it. I really look forward to it.
Thank you, Talar. Thank you, Talinn, as well. I just want to remind everyone that Giving Day is coming up on Wednesday, and it's a way to support UCI Armenian Studies language instruction, which is very important for our students. I hope that you will join us in giving as modestly or generously as you are able to do so. Thank you very much for joining us again. Hopefully we will see you in the fall, either in real life. Fall might not be the case, but at least we'll have some more virtual events. Thanks everyone for attending. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Take good care, everyone.